We're trying to finish by around noon to be respectful of your time as well. We really appreciate your time today. I know Senator Blumenthal has a question or two left, but I wanted to ask just a couple myself. I've been interested in Puerto Rico since I recognized the potential there, the economic potential of that part of the world. I've been involved in Puerto Rico since the 70s, and I was involved in major economic development work in Aguadilla, Mayaguez. Actually learned to surf in Rincon, but we won't talk about that another day. I am very concerned that today we're talking about, and Mr. Carrion, I agree with you. The potential there is unlimited, but this is not a crisis that just came up in the last year or two. It's been coming for decades. I remember in the 70s, we talked about economic development around water and power and labor and infrastructure. Here today, we had those same four quoted today, talking about how to get the economy going there. I'm really concerned that whatever we do here, we end up with Puerto Rico's ability to access capital, because without that, as we've all said, there's no future economic development. With that, you have to maintain confidence in the markets where it comes from. So that's my driving motivation as just one member up here. Mr. Pollack, I'd like to have you just talk a little bit more about your experience with this control board, authority, however we're going to characterize that. I know it's been done several times. District of Columbia, you guys mentioned New York Municipal Assistance Corporation back in the 70s. Talk to us about the applicability of that here. What were the deficits that were mentioned earlier? I think, Mr. Ravitch, you mentioned some of the problems that we had with those earlier. Can you talk to us about how that would potentially be an alternative here?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I think you're absolutely right that the economic problems have been long developing and have basically, in my judgment, come from a government-centric as opposed to a market-centric approach to the development of Puerto Rico, which was a huge long-term mistake, which we shouldn't repeat. The other cases I think are very interesting. I discussed three. Of course, they're all different in different ways, but they're all the same in that you have a public entity which has overborrowed. In the case of New York City, it actually did default on its debt, on its short-term notes. In all cases, you had a series of deficits leading to financing of deficits by debt and just borrowing to spend current money, as I said in my testimony. And in all cases, you had to come in with a different governance structure to get control, first of all, of what the facts are, and secondly, what the decisions are. As Secretary Simon, who was earlier cited, said after the New York experience, by forcing the issue in New York, they made the city of New York and the state of New York make decisions which they otherwise never would have made. I think that is also likely to be true of what would happen in Puerto Rico under such a structure. In Detroit, as was correctly said, the first step was an emergency manager. An emergency manager under the law of the state of Michigan has extremely wide fiscal and political powers that have been quite controversial. That was the first step, which then indeed lead to bankruptcy, but was very important, the emergency manager, in getting control of what the situation was. And in Washington, which is relevant because it is, as I said, not a state, and therefore directly subject to the jurisdiction of Congress, without the intervention of a sovereign federal state. You had what I think of as a very interesting bipartisan process which structured the control board. They had two outstanding chairmen of this board, Andrew Brimmer and Alice Rivlin. I think the point is right about who's on the board is essential. You'd want an outstanding chairman, as Washington did. You have to think a lot about the representation, and that's extremely important, and the various powers. But it has to be, in my view, a fairly powerful board. And I'll just mention one particular power that Washington had, which I think might be repeated for Puerto Rico, and that is the requirement that the board approve an independent chief financial officer for the jurisdiction, which could be appointed and by the government, but approved by the board and not removable by the government. So you get this really independent financial discipline, which in all these cases, in my judgment, is essential.
Thank you.
A correction. New York never defaulted. The Municipal Assistance Corporation was created in early June of 1975 to deal with the fact that the city of New York had, as the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico has, improvidently borrowed to cover its operating deficits. New York had $8 billion of short-term debt maturing, and there was no way whatsoever New York could pay it. So the first step, which was not imposed by anyone in Washington, but was suggested by the governor and the legislature, was to create the Municipal Assistance Corporation, and the sales tax and stock transfer tax that was collected by the city of New York was taken away from the city of New York and pledged to the holders of the long-term MAC bonds. So the general obligation debt of the city of New York was impaired by removing from the city a great deal of the city's revenues, and the financial community did not object to that at all. The control board was not created until September of that year, and that's because there continued to be a great deal of reluctance on the part of both the financial community and the union pension funds to invest in the MAC bonds without a tougher set of discipline over future budgets and future expenditures and future collective bargaining agreements. But there was never a default.
Thank you. Senator Blumenthal, I think, has a few